Everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of Thyroid Thursday. Today we're talking about T3 uptake. I got a bunch of questions regarding T3 uptake and why it's important. So I figured I'd get into what T3 uptake is and why it might be important, at least in my model. All right. So what is it? Why is it important? Back in the day when the labs were just measuring total T4 and TSH, and they wanted to know how much thyroid hormone was becoming free. Keep in mind that only about 1% of your thyroid hormone, T4, T3, is free at any given time. And so if only 1% is free, and we were back in time, we could only measure the total amount, we were trying to figure out how much of the hormone could become free. And so what they would do is they'd take total T4 and they'd use this T3 uptake test to kind of calculate something called the free thyroxine index. How much free T4 could become free. Nowadays, we can measure free T4, and so free thyroxine index becomes less valid to a lot of practitioners, and T3 uptake has become less valid to practitioners because they don't need it anymore because they're measuring free. And what they're often trying to do when you're diagnosed with hypothyroidism is find out, is TSH within a normal range and is free T4 within a normal range? And if it's not within a normal range, they just give you more T4 to try and raise the amount of free hormone. However, this is where T3 uptake becomes really important because it helps us understand why somebody with a normal TSH might still have low free hormone. So let's get into it. So T3 uptake does not measure your T3. What it really measures is the binding capacity of something called your thyroid-binding globulin. So thyroid hormone needs to be transported around through the body, T4 and T3. And to get transported around the body and not either be metabolized or go right into cells, it gets bound onto what we call binding globulin. So get transported, think in Uber, and then it can be transported to all the different tissues. And when it gets to a tissue that needs some thyroid hormone, that thyroid hormone becomes free of the binding globulin. It's usually a change in temperature and pH that causes the binding globulin, the Uber, to release its passenger, T4 or T3, and then T4 becomes free, T3 becomes free. So what this test does is it measures essentially how much binding globulin is available, and based on taking a look at that, we can get an idea how much would be free. Now we can just measure free hormones, but back in the day they couldn't do this. So how does this test work? They take this T3 resin binder. It's something that can bind T3, and they also put some radioactive iodine labeled T3 into a tube with some of your serum. And what they're looking for is to see after a period of time how much of the radioactive T3 binds to this T3 resin binder, and based on that they can get a percentage. So the normal range you might see on a lab report can vary a little bit, but generally you'll see the lab reference range at 24 to 39%. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that 24 to 39% of the radioactive iodine bound to this resin binder. Okay, and so what does this mean? So if your T3 uptake is lab high, this suggests that there's reduced thyroid binding globulin, reduced amounts of Ubers compared to how much thyroid hormone is in your blood. So there's lots of thyroid hormone, not a lot of binding proteins. So there's potentially going to be more than 1% free. So you might expect that there's going to be more free hormone available. So what kind of conditions might we see this in? We might see this in somebody who's got higher levels of androgens, because typically as androgens go up, sex hormone binding globulin goes down. And when sex hormone binding globulin goes up, thyroid hormone binding globulin goes up. So somebody who's got higher amounts of androgens, so maybe a woman struggling with PCOS, Or maybe somebody who's taking testosterone, they could have lower levels of binding globulins compared to how much thyroid hormones in the system, and they may have a T3 uptake that's elevated. They could have hyperthyroidism. So somebody who has excessive thyroid hormone production from their thyroid gland is probably not going to be able to produce as many binding globulins to keep up with it. So they may have a really high T3 uptake because the thyroid binding globulins in their serum are already saturated with T3 from what the thyroid gland's making. And so a lot of that resin, a lot of that radioactive T3 is binding to this resin binder. We might also see this with somebody who's on excessive amounts of thyroid hormone replacement. If their practitioner's goal is to optimize a lab value and they're providing excessive amounts of thyroid medication, then they may have a high T3 uptake because they're taking lots of medication. The liver isn't producing as much thyroid binding globulin in this situation, so they could have a high T3 uptake. We often see this in situations where somebody has inflammatory mechanisms going on. And we might also see this in somebody who's got liver dysfunction, because if you have liver dysfunction, you may not be able to produce those thyroid binding globulins. And so even a normal amount of thyroid hormone may wind up showing up as a high T3 uptake. If T3 uptake is low, this suggests that there's a higher level of thyroid binding globulin compared to how much thyroid hormone is in the blood. And conditions where we might see this is somebody who's got higher levels of estrogen. If they have estrogen dominance, compromised detoxification pathways, lots of estrogen metabolites, they may have increased estrogen in circulation. If they have increased estrogen in circulation, typically that's going to raise binding globulins, all the binding globulins. And so if I have lots and lots of binding globulins, I'm going to have less free hormone. And so when we do this test, all this radioactive iodine is probably, iodine labeled T3, is going to be able to bind to your body's thyroid binding globulin. So there's less to bind to this resin, so T3 uptake goes down. We can also see this in people who are on estrogen therapy. So if a woman's taking estrogen therapy to try and to fix her estrogen, low estrogen symptoms, then that can cause the binding globulins to elevate, and that could make them have more hypothyroid symptoms because they just can't get enough hormone free. We definitely see this, we can start to see this in patients with hypothyroidism for sure, because they're not making much thyroid hormone at the gland, and therefore they're going to have binding globulins, but there's not much hormone available, so most of it's going to wind up being bound to these binding globulins. Why does the test still matter? I already said that this test fell out of favor when we could start to measure free hormones. But why is it still relevant? To somebody like me who's looking for the root issues, okay, it's still important. For somebody who's just trying to manage a T4 value or maybe a T3 value, it's less important. They don't care. So if you had a normal TSH and you had a low free T4, they may say, we'll just give you more T4. And they can give you more T4 to try and get that into the lab range, but then what happens, it starts to add a lot more T4 into the circulation. It can tank TSH, so that can lower any production that your thyroid gland was going to make. And if there's this immune inflammatory process going on, that could flood the hypothalamus and the pituitary with T4, and that could create some upregulation of the sympathetic nervous system. And that excess T4 that's given to try and raise the free T4 value can also reduce the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3 and actually make somebody both hypo and hyperthyroid at the same time. And so this is, if you're going to somebody who's just trying to manage a free T4 value, then, and they're not asking the question, well, why is free T4 anyway? Why is free T4 low when I've already given them sufficient levels of thyroid hormone? They're just going to give more thyroid hormone and just say, well, I just got to keep raising it. But for somebody like me who's saying, hold on a second, we want to evaluate really what's going on, it gives us a window into what's happening in the body. If somebody's T3 uptake is high or low, and we measure it and we see it, then we can start to ask the questions. Why is it high? Why is it low, right? Is the person, maybe this is a person who's got problems with excessive amounts of androgen, and that's creating a lot of symptoms, and then we can understand why that might be. And so instead of flooding them with more thyroid hormone, we actually can address the real issue. We might say, if we looked at the T3 uptake and it's high, we might say, man, are we giving this person too much thyroid hormone to try and manipulate a lab value when it's really not what's really needed? So when we look at T3 uptake in context with T4 and T3 and free T4 and free T3 and T3 and TSH, it really tells us how the body's adapting to stress and how we can interpret the overall thyroid physiology and the overall stress response. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, put them below wherever you watch the video. And if you want more information like this, just send me a message on social media or wherever you watch the video of what types of questions you have and what kind of data you want.